It's great that we'll have the opportunity to hear from Rabbi Dr. Ben Scolnic, Adjunct Professor of Jewish Studies from Southern Connecticut State University. Ben is the spiritual leader of Temple Ben Shalom in Hamden, Connecticut since 1983. He's written at least 11 books, I read here, and obviously you're known for your long-standing collaboration with Altai. I know, or I'm told, you have a number of degrees to the PhD from Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary at Yale, so very impressive qualifications. And you've held positions at Yale and currently, obviously, at the Southern Connecticut State University. Today, Ben will be talking on something that I look very forward to listening to, Sheerah, founder of series and the pattern of assertive biblical women. So without further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Loud and clear.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Eva. One of these days we'll meet in person. And thanks to Altai and all of the people who put this together. And thank you. I'm coming in from Boston. I'm sitting in a hotel room, but so I hope you can hear me fine. So this is going to be a little bit different than a lot of the other presentations. I'm going to be talking about Sheerah, founder of towns, and also talking about assertive women in the Bible. So I'm going to start with a very, maybe one of the most anomalous passages in the Hebrew Bible. This is in 1 Chronicles. I'll explain a little bit about 1 Chronicles in a moment. Sheerah, the daughter of a famous biblical figure, Ephraim, son of Joseph, builds both Lower and Upper Beth-horon and Uzzen-Sheerah. The English translation, Sheerah, is pronounced Sheerah in Hebrew, and I'm going to try to do that. Here is the passage. The descent. Now, this is a genealogy in 1 Chronicles. I'll explain that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the last books of the Hebrew Bible, and maybe were written last. That is, most scholars think that they were written in the 400s BCE, but that doesn't mean that they don't have early genealogies. And 1 Chronicles 1 through 9 it starts with Adam and basically tells history just through genealogy without really any narrative except for a few little things like I'm about to show you. So here is one of the tribes, one of the main tribes was Ephraim. The descendants of Ephraim, Shuthelah, Bered his son, Tachat his son, Eliada his son, Tachat his son, Zabad his son, and Shuthelah his son. Ezer and Eliad were killed by the native-born men of Gath when they went down to seize their livestock. Their father Ephraim mourned for them many days, and his relatives came to comfort him. Then he made love to his wife again, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. He named him Beriah. Beriah means like in evil, because there had been misfortune in his family. His daughter was Sheerah, who built Lower and Upper Beth-horon, as well as Uzzen-Sheerah. I'm reading this in Hebrew. Uvito Sheerah, Bativen et Beth-horon hatachton ve'et ha'elyon ve'et Uzzen-Sheerah. And then it goes on, and Repha was his son, and Resheph his son, and Telah his son, and Tachan his son, Ladan his son, Amihud his son, Elishama his son, Nun his son, Joshua his son. So what's the anomaly? In 1 Chronicles 7, what we just read, Ephraim is a chieftain in Canaan. His sons go cattle rustling and are killed. And like Job in the book of Job, he mourns and is comforted and has more children. Again, just to go over it, 1 Chronicles 1 through 9 is a series of genealogies. And somehow this moves without me moving it. Some of the genealogies seem very ancient, even though the book was edited in the 400s. Now, what's the anomaly? The Chronicles passage does not fit with one of the main narratives of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly the main narrative of the Torah, the Pentateuch, about Joseph and the enslavement in Egypt and then the return to Canaan. Why is this passage such an anomaly? In the prelude to the basic story of the Pentateuch Torah, the Exodus Sinai narrative, Joseph, son of Jacob, sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt, rises to become the most powerful man next to the Pharaoh. In Egypt, Manasseh and Ephraim are born to Joseph by Asnat, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Ephraim dies in Egypt. He never goes to Canaan. Exodus 1 through 6 to 7. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. And it's not until hundreds of years later that Joshua is the leader who conquers the land of Canaan. Okay. So how shall we understand our passage? Lower and Upper Beth-horon are very famous. They're the scene of battles through the centuries, from the book of Joshua to the Maccabees to the Romans. But we never hear another word about Uzzen-Sheerah, which makes the story more authentic because it does not seem to be an etiology of a well-known toponym. There's only one Ephraim, and the areas involved are where the tribe of Ephraim settled. Is there a genealogical code here? Well, interpreted in light of a genealogical code where a female may indicate some kind of secondary status or intrusion, like the tribes born from concubines, this may reflect the incursion of Ephraim elements into cities which were already established. Seen from the point of view of the local elements, they may be ascribed to a female eponym. That's a theory. That is, there may have been an ancient Ephraimite genealogy that explained how their ancestors were rebuffed in Gath, but then came to those cities, and the genealogy worked backward from the name Uzzen-Sheerah to create a female figure. Since, however, the story has no parallel, this is just a guess, and a simple reading shows textual difficulties. There's an intriguing article by Leah that cast doubt on the textual integrity of the passage. Still, the passage is a story that makes sense. Since there are no grown sons, the daughter becomes a founder. You'll remember that all the other sons have died, and then he makes love to his wife and has a baby, but that child is going to take a long time for him to grow up, and that leaves a kind of power vacuum in the Ephraimite tribe. And here this daughter, this Sheerah, steps up. But this leaves us with an incredible anomaly that contradicts the major sequence of the Torah Pentateuch, and it seems to be an authentic genealogy, glaring in its textual roughness. And so that leaves us with a female builder of towns. Now, what do we know about other biblical founders of cities or towns? Well, in a very famous crux, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he then founded a city, named the city after his son Enoch. All Sunday school kids ask a question like, who did Cain marry? And how could he build a city if there was only Cain, his wife, and a child? But I'll leave that aside. Another city builder is Nimrod in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. One of my favorite passages is there's a very famous town called Bethel, and before that it was called Luz. And the tribes of Joseph, and one of the tribes of Joseph was Ephraim. They are going to attack this city, and a guy comes out, and he says, and they say, look, if you'll get us into the city, we'll treat you well. And he does that. It reminds me a lot of the story of the conquest of Jericho. Leaving that aside, he's spared, and then he goes to the land of the Hittites, where he builds a city and calls it Luz. And so I'm calling this man a loser. But thank you. But in all of the Bible, there's never another woman among the builders. The Bible credits Sheerah with founding not only the city which bears her name, Uzzen-Sheerah, but also two other important towns, Upper and Lower Beth-horon, in the hill country of Ephraim. Now, Sheerah is the only female builder of cities in the Hebrew Bible, but there are many other assertive women. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a pattern of assertive women. One is Achsah, daughter of the giant killer Caleb. Caleb is one of the two people, along with Joshua, who survives the generation of the wilderness and goes into Canaan, and he kills giants. And then after that, he says, if somebody else will conquer this other place, I'll give that man my daughter. And she's married off to Achsah's married off to the war hero. But she's really not very happy because what she and her new husband have been given is pretty lousy land. So she comes back to her father on a donkey, and he says, what can I do for you? She says, do me a special favor. Since you've given me as Negev land, Negev is desert land, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her these water rights to Upper and Lower Gulot. We all know about the importance of water rights. So this is a woman who has been given away as a prize, but she's coming back and saying, you know what, that's not good enough, Daddy. You've got to give me my rights, and he does. Sheerah and Achsah take their place among more famous characters, from Eve, and I'm going to explain this in a minute, whom God intended to be Adam's equal, to Sarah, Rebecca, Shiphrah and Puah, Yocheved, Pharaoh's daughter, Miriam, Deborah, Jael, Hannah, Abigail, Bathsheba, Jezebel, Athaliah, Huldah, Esther, Judith, and so on, all of whom fulfill what I'm calling God's original purpose for their gender. Why do I say that? There's a very famous idea, a very famous critical idea, that in Genesis chapter 1, men and women are both created in the image of God, but in chapter 2, the woman is subordinate because she's created out of Adam's rib. This is a very popular conception. But when God creates this woman, he wants her to be an Ezer Kenegdo. And the King James Bible and most English translations since then have said this is a helpmeet for him. That is, she's a helper for a man. The woman is subordinate to the man. This Ezer Kenegdo, however, will provide a level of companionship that the animals are incapable of. Again, that phrase has been mistranslated, and I'm very influenced by Emily Wilson and her study of these kinds of things in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and she has an idea of direct translation, which is, of course, what we should always do. And so the idea that this woman is subordinate does turn out to be true because Eve does what she does, and that turns out to be true. That doesn't mean that that was God's original conception. So if you look at the Hebrew words themselves, and Ezer Kenegdo never appears again, but Ezer does not just mean helper. In the name Eliezer, for instance, God does more than help. God saves. God's a shield. God's a protector. God is a salvation. So Ezer Kenegdo, which is what God creates Eve to be, is someone who is like him and is his equal and counterpart. And in case you don't believe that, when Adam says, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, he's saying, this is a Hebrew idiom that appears many other times in the Hebrew Bible, and it always means we are equals. So when Adam sees Eve, he says, we are equals. So yes, the Bible is patriarchal and male dominated, but God's original purpose in both Genesis 1, where both are created in the image of God, and Genesis 2 was to create two genders that were equal. And women in the Bible, when we see them act and speak and relate to God, are assertive players who have agency in their family or political situations. So I'm just going to run through these very quickly. And while the quote is on there, I'll just tell the story very quickly. Sarah, Abraham's wife, cannot have a child. And so she comes up with a plan which actually goes against God's plan. And she takes a surrogate, her slave, Hagar, an Egyptian slave, as her surrogate mother, and Hagar gets pregnant and sort of flaunts it against Sarah, and Sarah drives her out. But Abraham says, look, you can do whatever you want. She's your slave, even though the woman is pregnant with his child. So Hagar runs out, and for the first time in the Bible, an angel speaks to somebody. He speaks not just to a woman, but to a slave girl. And the angel, who is just a manifestation of God, at this point in the Bible, angels do not have separate identities or anything like that. And he speaks to her, and he has a conversation with her, and he says, go back, and you're going to have a son. And his name is going to be Ishmael, and he's going to be the father of the Arab peoples who are going to fulfill part of the covenant of being as many as the stars in the sky and the sand in the sea. And she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. And that well that is then created to save her life, it's called Be'er Lachai Roi. And the text says it's still there between Kadesh and Bered. So it is not exactly the founding of a city, but in a sense, Hagar founds that well or that oasis. So that's one passage. Another passage, God speaks directly to Rebecca. Rebecca is Abraham's daughter-in-law, Isaac's wife. And he says in this political allegory that two nations are in your womb. But the younger one is going to be the guy. He's going to be the one to inherit the covenant. So Rebecca knows from God, from the womb, that the younger one, Jacob, is going to be the one to inherit the covenant. And so she always favors him. And then when Isaac is on, her husband is on his deathbed, and he says to the older son, Esau, some of you are very familiar with, it's a very famous story, go out and get me some of that game that I like, and then I'll bless you and make you my heir. Rebecca takes matters into her own hands, and she says, Jacob, dress up like Esau. And Jacob says, wait a minute, how can I do this? My father's on his deathbed. He's old and blind, and I'm going to pretend to be Esau, and I'm going to use this subterfuge to get the covenant. I mean, this is a terrible thing. And she says, don't worry about it. My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me. So here are these male actors, Isaac and Esau and Jacob, and Rebecca's controlling the whole situation, and it's successful, and Jacob becomes the heir. Now notice that women are in control. So Sarah was in control of the situation about that child, and Rebecca is very much in control. Notice that God supports Sarah, says to Abraham, yeah, it's okay, throw out the girl, saves Hagar, speaks directly to Hagar and to Rebecca about the destinies of their sons. I'm moving on very quickly. And when the Pharaoh says, kill all the baby boys in Egypt, he says to the midwives, when you see it's a boy, kill them. Well, these midwives are the first conscientious objectors, and they won't do it. I mean, the midwives are all about life. They're not going to kill the babies. And when the Pharaoh hauls them into the court and says, how could you do that? They said, it's not our fault. These Hebrew women, they're like animals. They just drop the kids before we can even get there. It's not our fault. But here are Shiphrah and Puah, these brave women who are standing up to the Pharaoh and lying to him and getting away with it. So what happens? The infanticide does go on, and all the Jewish boys are being thrown into the river. But there's one woman, again, a lot of you know this story. Some of us grew up with baby Moses in the bulrushes and things like that. So the mother, Yocheved, as we learned later, puts the little baby in the little ark, and the older sister Miriam follows him, and they happen to put the ark right in the Nile, right where Pharaoh's daughter happens to be bathing. I don't believe in coincidences, and she knows that this is one of the Hebrew babies. And so now you have what's going to happen? Who's going to nurse this child? And I say wink, wink here, because the sister says, "Oh, look, do you want me to get somebody to nurse the baby?" And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Oh, that would be great. And you know what? I'm going to pay her." So Miriam takes the baby home to her biological mother to nurse the baby. And she's getting paid for it by Pharaoh's daughter, right? And all these women know exactly what's going on. They know, they know the baby's going back. And these women are like a conspiracy of subterfuge against this tyrant, against this genocidal, infanticidal, is that a word? Maniac who's killing all the baby boys. And the girls win, and that baby grows up to be Moses, who saves the day for the Israelites. Again, I'm just going very quickly. Later on, Moses in Numbers chapter 12 marries a Cushite woman, a black woman, and Miriam and Aaron seem to take great umbrage at this. That's the same Miriam. So this is the older sister, and clearly she's leading this. I don't know how to say this in any other way. This is racist. And so how is Miriam punished by God? God says, you think you're white? I'll show you white. And he makes her so like leprous white with scales and everything like that. Her skin became leprous. God has an incredible sense of humor here. You want to be white? I'll show you real white. And then Moses has to plead with her. But my point just right here is that Miriam is leading a kind of revolution, saying, you know what makes Moses so special? Doesn't God speak to us too? Okay. Again, very quickly, there's now it says, now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidot, was leading Israel at that time. Look at how unremarked this is. I know that's not a word, but this should be a remarkable thing. There's a woman who's a prophet. There's a woman who's leading Israel. There's a woman who's a judge, and she's holding court, and all the Israelites are going to her. And notice there's nothing special that's said about it. It's like, that there have been other female prophets, and there are, and so there's a battle, and she gets a guy named Barack. That's where Barack Obama's name comes from, who's looking better all the time. Anyway, and she says to this general, "I want you to go and lead this war." And he says, "I'm not going without you." And she says, "Okay, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." And we all think that she's talking about herself, that if she goes into the battle with Barak, that everybody's going to give her the credit, not Barak. We don't know that when the enemy general Sisera is running away, he comes to the tent of a woman named Jael, the wife of an ally of the Canaanites named Hever. And she's, "Okay, come on in, Sisera." Now, this is a very smart woman. There's the enemy general has run away from the defeated troops. She knows exactly who's won and who hasn't. She brings him in. She brings him in, gives him food, and he lies down, and she drives a peg through the temple, through his temple into the ground, and he obviously dies. So she takes matters into her own hands, and that's not a bad phrase for what all these women are doing. They're taking matters into their own hands. Again, very quickly, there's a woman named Hannah. She's infertile. The men don't understand what's going on, but God does, and her prayers are answered. A remarkable story that a lot of people don't know is the story of Abigail. Abigail is married to a major honcho in Calebite country in southern Israel. And David at this point is not king yet. He's like a mafioso chieftain who's going around exacting protection from everybody around. And this Nabal says, "Well, the king is Saul. I don't have to recognize you." And when David says, "I want protection money," he won't give it, and he's very insulting. And Abigail says, "Oh, that's not a good idea." And she goes to David. This is Abigail, Nabal's wife, with all these provisions, 5 dressed sheep, 100 cakes of raisins. And others, "My husband won't give protection, but I will." And she gives this incredible speech to David saying, "Look, you're going to be the guy, and someday you're going to be the king. And don't worry about my husband. He's an idiot." And so David says, "Look, I was going to kill everybody. But because you did this, you remarkable, beautiful, wonderful woman, I'm not going to kill everybody." And Abigail goes home, and she tells Nabal what she did. And Nabal is very upset, and he mysteriously dies. Now, it doesn't say this. It says the Lord struck Nabal and he died, but I think Abigail knocked him off. And just to show you how smart this woman was, she goes back to David, and she becomes his wife, and she becomes a queen. So she really upgrades from Nabal, whose name means fool, to be the king. Moving on very quickly, when David is old, he has the love of his life, Bathsheba. Yes, that's the famous story of David and Bathsheba. But this is at the end of the life, and there's a guy named Adonijah who is the third son, but the oldest living son of David, and he is saying that he should be king. And Bathsheba comes up with this thing and says, "Oh, honey, you always said that my son Solomon would be king." David is on his deathbed. He doesn't know what's going on. And the prophet Nathan backs up Bathsheba, and Bathsheba gets her son Solomon to be king, even though he was way down in the pecking order. There's another prophetess named Huldah who gives the major prophecy of doom of what's going to happen to the land of Judah. Again, I'm just going quickly. The famous story of Esther. She takes her life into her own hands. She goes into the king. He says, what can I do for you? You risked your life by coming into the court. She says, "Just come to dinner." And so then over a course of a couple of nights, she finally gets in that all the Jewish people are going to be killed. And she saves the day for the Jewish people. Judith is not in the Hebrew Bible, but it's such a great story because she seduces this enemy general and cuts off his head, and that's, to me, one way to get ahead. So when we see women in action, Sheerah, the founder of towns, takes her place among more famous characters from Eve through all of these women, some of whom I didn't even mention, but they're all well-drawn characters who fulfill God's original purpose for their gender. So my claim is that women's secondary status was not God's original intent. And when we actually see women, we see them emerge even in a patriarchal society to be what they were supposed to be. So here are my goals for today. I've done one, to show that biblical women living in a patriarchal society are shown as active participants in events and stories. But I think I have time. So I want to go on and suggest that biblical foundation stories, like Greek foundation stories, are pluralistic. I, too, am very grateful for the book Foundation Myths from Nisha McSweeney. I think it's a remarkable book. I think one essay is better than the next. But one of the great essays there is by Yerad Malkin. And I want to apply his wonderful insights to my passage, 1 Chronicles 7, and other genealogies in 1 Chronicles that show continuous habitation of the land. I want to compare that to an assertion of Athenian autochthony, and then the usual Pentateuchal narrative as a story about what Malkin calls foreign founders who returned after generations. And I know that Nisha is on here, and she gave such an elegant introduction, excellent, elegant summary. I want to quote her. This is her summary of what Malkin did. In Hebrew tradition, the arrival of the foreign founder is incorporated into a single linear foundation narrative, signifying a break with the past and heralding the establishment of a new order. The only problem with that sentence is that the Chronicles thing is against that, right? It is against that whole single linear foundation narrative. It shows that other things were going on. She says, in contrast, it seems that the foreign founders of Greek myth are embedded in plural foundation discourses where multiple parallel narratives operate on different levels. In Hebrew tradition, the arrival of the foreign founder is incorporated. Did I already read that? I think I already read that. Okay. These levels include the natural foundation of place, the origins of the ethnos, ethnic group or regional collective, and the political formation of the polis, the city-state. The parallel stories of Greek myth, when compared with the more linear narratives of Hebrew foundation accounts, highlight the fundamental importance of plurality and variation in the Greek tradition. The contrast with Hebrew myth suggests, therefore, that foundation discourses were a central structuring principle of Greek mythic traditions. I don't disagree with that second part, of course, at all. But if we would look, in other ways, there are other examples of plurality in foundings in the Bible. So, for instance, if we take Greek stuff about Delphi, we know, and we would compare it to the narratives in the Bible about Jerusalem. And I understand, of course, there's a difference between polytheism and monotheism, but both have cultic histories that pre-existed these associations by centuries. That is, that Delphi has stories about a virgin foundation, about Apollo creating it from just the natural site. But we have other stories where there were already shrines to other gods on that site. So I don't want to ask the logical question, which claim is correct, the previous owners of the Virgin Foundation. We don't want to see these stories as opposing claims, but ask what we can learn about the nature of this ancient literature. So that brings me back to the story of Sheerah. So a character in a very different narrative about the founding of Ephraim and my towns that does not know about the sojourn in Egypt, the basic linear narrative of the Bible. So my point is that biblical foundation stories may be pluralistic too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. In the usual way, questions either from the people here or from online attendees, please. Does anybody have any question? So, Ben, if I get you right, you seem to say that we take female leadership as an exception, but when you put all these stories in a row, they're not quite that exceptional. They seem to be there all the time.
I don't know about all the time, but you're certainly right in what you say. And again, I didn't mention everybody that I've got, right? There was Athaliah who was a queen. There's Jezebel. There are all sorts of people. What I'm saying is that when we do see women, they have agency. And the phrase I didn't use that I'd like to put in now is social reality. I believe that even in a patriarchal society, that the women were I don't know how to say it, were doing a lot of stuff, that they were in a lot more of a control. That there's a pattern of stories where we see women so assertive, having so much agency, manipulating things, right? I have to think that reflects some real social reality.
Okay, but they still get all the blame for manipulating. The men never do.
No, but I'm not using manipulating there in the way it came out.
No,
What
exactly.
because when a man manipulates, that's fine, right?
Yeah.
No, but I mean that they asserted themselves, right? They asserted themselves, and I'm saying this in a neutral way. I'm not saying it's bad, it's good. I'm saying that they did what they felt they needed to do, and I'm saying more power to them.
Excellent. Any more questions? I'll go on. Do you know of any negative reaction to these women initiatives? Like you have this Sheerah that you mentioned, who's a founder of cities, which is unusual because typically you have men founding cities.
Sure.
So do we know of anyone who said, oh, that's an anomaly, that shouldn't have happened?
No. No. Again, one of the remarkable things is how unremarked on these things are. Again, I'll come back to Deborah. There's Huldah. These were female prophets. The fact that it doesn't say, oh, here's a unique story, right? There never was a prophet, who was a woman before. The fact that there's nothing around it, there's nothing about it, says to me that it was unremarkable.
This is very interesting because it is my feeling as well that in the Greek tradition, whenever you have women represented as anomalies in history, it is always at a later time from an author who tries to look backward and say, oh, look, this has happened, but it shouldn't be there.
Right. Well, you know what? If you wanted to do that, yes, I could find rabbis of the Midrash who certainly were saying, oh, well, she only built the cities because there were no men, or they do something like that.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, please, Alta. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That was a very impressive line of powerful, assertive women to give context to your founder woman, Sheerah. And I really have to go back to these sources because it never looked to me as clear and as strong as your pointed selection did. And something that really struck a chord with me was that you say that many of these women are stepping up in a situation where there is a power vacuum, which is so close to what I've been observing in amongst the Hellenistic basilicai, where we can in fact draw clear parallels, even though I would say when we then look at the Hellenistic sources, literature, or also Roman literature later on, then we very often see a denigration of these women, very different from mostly a positive representation of the assertive women in the Bible. Well, let's take aside Eva, not you. Eve, not Eva, because of all the hardship she brought. So that would be one little contrast. But I would like to add one other question of also provoking you a little bit, because one difference between your and my approach is that I tend to believe more in symbolic values of the literary narratives, and would concede some more historical content only to later stories. So with Sheerah, the daughter of Ephraim, we are still in a time where I would assume that most figures just tend to have symbolic meanings, often etiological meanings. But of course, one may discuss one may discuss the content of possible historicity. But if you try to think of Sheerah as potentially just a symbolic creation, is there a possibility that Uzzen-Sheerah may be the name of a town which has given birth to the creation of a mythical figure,
but I suggested that as a possibility. I said that there was a place that was in Sharon, maybe it worked backwards.
Okay, you said that.
I did say that as a possibility. But to me, I don't really care whether Sheerah was real or not. I don't care if she was historical or not. What's interesting to me is that there were these genealogies that don't fit with the basic, linear narrative of the 5 books of Moses, right? And so that means that there were other traditions, that it was more pluralistic, right, than everybody thinks, that these genealogies could exist. What is this genealogy? That is that these things coexisted, that there was more pluralism to these ancient traditions, and one side actually won. But here's a tribal account, and whether it's historical or symbolic, I don't care. But I think it's very ancient, and the ancientness manifests itself through how bad that text is. Right? There's repetitions. There's names that are left out. It doesn't make doesn't make very good sense, which makes it very authentic to me. All I'm saying is it's a very ancient genealogy that was passed down that goes against the basic story of the Torah, and that to me is really interesting.
I agree. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. Methodologically, that's very strong. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat from Nisha, and then Alice has her hand raised online. So, Ben, do you think the process of narrowing involved in textual canonization acted, it says there, to iron out contrasting narratives in the Hebrew tradition?
Sorry, yes, that's very well put. Let me try to make sure I've got that. That this big linear narrative won out, right? The kind of thing that I'm pointing out did not win. And we know that in the development of traditions, there are things, whatever we're talking about, there is, there were all sorts of things going on in early Christianity, and the Paul stuff won, right? Yes, but I do think iron out is an interesting way to do it. There was one side that absolutely won. The side I'm talking about did not win, but I want to acknowledge that side did exist.
Excellent. Alice, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm sort of coming from as I say, I come from the perspective of early Christianity, and in sort of lots of sort of early Christian, like the mass narratives, for example, they're often using these sort of remarkable sort of biblical figures like Judas, especially, and often the women aren't necessarily exceptional, but it's more the circumstances that kind of are exceptional. Like, for example, the siege, like Judas, it's being a sort of siege that she's, protecting her city from, and that sort of in itself kind of is the sort of justification. I just wonder whether that
was that a statement or a question?
Well, it was sort of, yeah, I guess a response. I was wondering whether you think it's more the sort of circumstances, yeah. And so that's why they're not necessarily remarking on it.
Okay, I think that fits in with what Altai's talking about the Seleucid queens and things like that. If you have a vacuum, if you have a situation, if there are circumstances that allow for it, that the women do step up, and so we see them, coming to the fore, and that, and that's a wonderful thing. But I still think that even with the unusualness of those circumstances, that this does reflect something about women, right? That they weren't, these put down people, but given a chance, given the right circumstances, they were as smart and as capable as anybody. And again, I think that someplace in there was a social reality about what was really going on at home, and what might have been going on, in even a king's family, and that women had a lot more influence than we might think.
Are there any other questions online or here? If not, let us thank Ben once more. And because this is the end of the session, let us thank Jean and Ben together. Thank you very much for two wonderful papers and an excellent start.